Hello, everybody, and welcome to Whiz, your family-friendly podcast where we discuss D&D Onslaught, Dice Masters, HeroClix, and the other entertaining games made by WizKids. I'm WizDad, and I may or may not be recovering from a sugar coma from all the candy from last night's Halloween. Oh, man, if I'd never have to look at another Almond Joy, I'd probably be okay. I will be your guide for navigating the competitive and casual scenes of the WizKids Triforce of Gaming. It's Onslaught Wednesday. You know what that means. We're going to be talking all about D&D Onslaught. Today, I'm going to go over what I feel like is pros and cons of the game system. So we're not talking about the developers, the community, anything like that. Maybe inherently we might talk about them a tiny bit, but basically I'm going to look at the Onslaught system because I've been playing a lot of Onslaught the past couple of weeks and talk about what I love about the system. And then certain things about Onslaught I don't like, and how maybe they can fix that going forward. But before we get to that, of course, let's go over the WizKids Progress Report.
Kowalski, Progress Report.
So it's November 1st. A lot of new releases have come out today. Well, some releases have come out today. I know my local store, Onslaught specific-wise, we did finally get this week the rest of our Onslaught order. I may have mentioned before that my store has bought in, thanks to a lot of my excitement, has bought into Onslaught, which is great. So they've bought a lot of the factions, the base game, stuff like that. And today they finally got the rest of the shipment, including 2 of the Ancient Construct Storyline OP kits, so that way we could run a game with 8 people. They also got the other store, support kits, which includes the alternative Drom Skull, the Loot Goblins, some of the treasure cards, a treasure box also. So super pumped about that. We're going to start building our community. I'm so excited. I did take a few minutes and opened one of the Ancient Construct Storyline OP kits just so I can see the figure in size and put it together. And it's awesome. It's amazing because you do literally put the thing together. You don't have to glue it or anything. It fits together, kind of like a usual kind of small statue type figure. So it's really, really nice. It looks great. I can't wait to run the event. So it's out there. Some people have already been playing for a while. Unfortunately, by store, sometimes we get things a little late. So definitely check in with your store. You could probably still order the kits today if you still need to get a copy of them. For the other games, I will say for HeroClix, don't forget that pre-release started this past week. My store also got their Wheels of Vengeance pre-release kit as well. Or not the kit, I'm sorry. We got our usual allotment of bricks. And we're excited locally to finally get into some Wheels of Vengeance. I've been hearing some very good things about the set going forward. And we'll talk more about that on Friday. There has been some sightings of the Wakanda Forever OP kit that is supposed to be released today. So that is happening. It's out there. You could go out onto the HeroClix Facebook page, HeroClix players and collectors. It may be on ClickStuff, something like that. You'll be able to see the new dials. Some of it's kind of interesting. But yeah, it's a little bit of excitement in this off season. We're finally, new month means new releases. So very, very excited. But let's now go ahead and go into Fishing with WizDad. Let's talk more about Onslaught. Let's talk about, what I feel like is the benefit of the whole game and the negatives that the game currently has.
Get your gear, little man. We're going fishing. And I mean now.
So you may be wondering, WizDad, why on earth are you bothering telling us about the pros and cons? And my thought process behind this is simply this. I don't want anyone out there to think that I just blindly support every game that WizKids comes out with, that I just take everything they give me and just everything they give me in a game and just say, oh, this is great, they can do no wrong. Absolutely not. Like my own kids, sometimes things don't roll out as well as they should. Goodness knows I've talked a lot about how Onslaught has kind of stumbled out of the gates when it comes to launching the game, but they've kind of recovered a bit based off of further releases, the reaction from the developers and being, involved in promoting the game. It isn't just they made the game and just hands off. There's some definitely good things going on in the community and in the game itself. But I wanted to talk about the game, the system, what makes Onslaught, and talk about the pros and the cons. And the way I think I'm going to do this is I'm going to do a back and forth. I'm going to start with the pro and then go to a con, and there might be some intertwining of the two, because I might talk about a con, but there might be some pros out of it, or I might talk about a pro and there might be some cons. So the first thing I really want to talk about, having played now a lot of games of Onslaught, like I've played multiple hours, like goodness knows I might be creeping up to about 60-70 hours ish, probably more. I haven't sat down and thought about it. And the first thing I want to talk about is strictly the initiative system. So keep in mind, Onslaught is kind of a D&D adjacent game. It's one that heavily borrows from how 5e works when it comes to you having a bonus action, standard action, movement action per your turn. And so one of the things they borrow is the initiative system. Now, obviously, initiative in D&D works where at the beginning of combat, your characters roll a d20. Typically it's just they add their dexterity modifier, but some characters have other abilities that make their initiative higher. And then you play the whole battle out at that initiative outside of, we're talking a general case. There might be some other cases where you might, push your initiative lower, stuff like that. In Onslaught, it's completely different. So with Onslaught, and we're talking just a normal 10 card setup, so just a 1v1 game, because I know there's, like I mentioned it when I was doing the Frogmire scenarios, there's like a 4-player setup, stuff like that. No, we're talking 1v1. Basically how it works is you roll at the beginning of the game, whoever's highest out of, however you want to do it, but it's usually like you roll 1d20, whoever's highest is considered the first player. The first player gets the initiative 1 card. And so you have your 5 characters, your opponent has their 5 characters. The person who has the initiative 1 card places that on who they want to go first, and that is face up, so you know who it is. And then at that point, the initiative cards 2 through 6 are shuffled, and then whoever is not first player gets 3 of those cards, and then the first player gets 2 of those. And then they shuffle the 7 through 10 cards, and each person gets 2 cards. Now, the rules specifically say the active player shuffles the cards and deals them out. That would be one of those kind of loose case how that works. I found it's much faster to simply have the active player do the 2 through 6, and while they're doing the 2 through 6, the non-active player is shuffling the 7 through 10, and then they kind of just hand each other the amount of cards. It's a little wonky at first because, handing cards back and forth, shuffling a small amount of cards. But overall, I think it's a great way of doing it. Because it is the first player gets 1, that means 2 through 6. The second player at least has 3 of those. And then the other player has the other 2. So you can have a scenario where first player has 1, 5, and 6. It could have 1, 2, 3. But it leads itself to a system where there's not a lot of dead time. There's not a lot of, I'm waiting forever for my opponent to go. That's an issue in HeroClix sometimes where, more convoluted, complicated teams could take 4 to 5 minutes to really, in a timed scenario. Remember, Onslaught isn't timed. It's timed by rounds, not by time, unless you're in a tournament. So HeroClix could be a lot slower in the sense that you're having to wait for your opponent to go and be like, oh my goodness. Onslaught, it's not the same way. Onslaught, typically it's a back and forth. Sure, there might be rounds where your opponent has 1, 2, and 3. Okay. It's not as if those characters have a ton to do. It's usually only those 3 characters that are moving, not your whole team like in HeroClix. And so that happens every single round, and then the number 1 card goes to the second person. And whenever you're doing your initiative, I should mention, initiative cards you put on your character's dials or whatever you want, you assign them to each character, and you put them face down except for the first initiative. So there's a little bit of secretive there where you could decide, okay, very clearly this person's going to go second. At least that's what your opponent might think, but you put it on another character. It's very unique. There might be other games that do it similarly, but I actually like it. I like it because it adds a little bit of randomness. A little bit. It's not super randomness, right? Like getting cards 2 through 6. It's unlikely you're going to get 4, 5, 6 every single round, right? Like, or you're getting the worst cards all the time. It's very unlikely. But it does change up the games, right? Like, you could be in a heated death match and you are not first player, but you get 2, 3, 4. So your opponent has a chance to do something, and then you've got 3 characters to go in. Oh, it's so great. Like, it's a really cool system. Shuffling the cards, sealing them out, sure, it's a little wonky there, you know. You get used to it. The more games you play, the more you're just kind of like... Sometimes if I'm an active player, my opponent will be setting the round back up, you know, turning the round to round 2 and doing his cooldowns and moving some cards around, whatever we need to do, while I'm getting the initiative cards handed out, if that makes sense. So that's one of the things I like about this system as opposed to other games. I like that it's not just my turn, then your turn, round over. It's a back and forth. And then that's not even to mention the fact that you have monsters. Almost every scenario has NPC monsters, and that adds the wrinkle of, okay, this monster acts on initiative 5.5. So if I'm first player, I'm hoping I know I get the first card. I'm hoping I could get 2 more so I can act before this monster can. And it really adds another wrinkle in there to be like, okay, do I move this monster now, or do I chance it and get closer to the monster initiative and then make an act, even though my opponent might interject? So I love the initiative system. I think it's very well thought out. It's not complicated once you kind of get the hand of the cards. The handing out of the cards is really the only complicated part of it. Some of the cons. Let's talk about conditions. It's not to say that I don't like conditions. I love conditions. There's just a ton of them. And that's perfectly okay. But some of them, it could feel intimidating, which is a condition, funny enough. But it can also feel a little complicated at times, trying to keep up with all the conditions and all those condition tokens, which I'll get to this in a second. That's kind of a separate con. But conditions in general, as someone who's played a lot of Red Wizards, for example, burning, I dish out burning all the time. Poison, if I'm playing Zaelshin, I think that's his name, he dishes out poison. Like, there's so many conditions. Rooted, slowed, stunned, poisoned, disarmed, invisible, weakened. There's so much. And that's perfectly fine. Like, I like it. But it's also a little trouble to keep up with. Like, trying to think of it from... Keep in mind, I come from HeroClix, right? It's really hard to memorize all of that. The game does come in the rulebook at the end. A little list of some of the conditions, but not all of them. Obviously, some of them are more... what's the word? More faction specific. Right, for example, Bedlam, I believe, has curse. So she's able to dish out cursed to a person. Well, cursed is a condition. So that's the only person who's able to do it. There's a many arrows, Red Wizard, Cell Swords. Like, everyone kind of has their own conditions. A little bit of their own conditions. It's kind of hard to keep up with. Now, once again, talking about negatives, but also talking about positives. Luckily, WizKids has done a really good job of having a character condition sheet, a reference sheet. It is on their D&DOnslaught.com website. It has a list. It is, if you want to know how many conditions, it's 6 pages long. Like, 6 pages. The first page is just the common condition tokens. Then they have one for Harpers, one for Zentarum, one for many arrows, a little thing for Red Wizards, and a little thing for Cell Swords. And then they have another additional ones that talks about summoners and minions and charges and stuff like that. Print out this sheet 100%. If you're playing this game, print it out. I would argue this probably needs to come with the starter set, but I understand it's, kind of hard to do that when you have a lot of tokens that go to specific factions. That's fine. Either way, it needs to be emphasized. This condition reference chart is very important because it's hard to keep up with a lot of the stuff in the game. The game is very complicated in a good way. It's not overly complicated like HeroClix sometimes where it's like I'm having to keep up with all these powers. Your 5e knowledge is able to translate very well in this game. It's learning the initiative system. It's learning how all the conditions work. I will state, for example, some of these conditions are self-casted. So, for example, you might have Pureblood. Zelashah, the one who does all the poison I was mentioning, can cast Pureblood, which basically gives him a +2 range, or +2 to his maximum range, increasing it to 2 to 5, and then when he hits somebody, they get poisoned. I don't typically, me personally, get that little token out and put it under him. I just note it on my card, on his little dial, right? I'll know, because it only lasts a turn until his next activation, because it's fading, that it's going to go away. So, you're going to get a ton of tokens. Like, I have a baggie here that is just full of tokens. And some of them are really hard to figure out who goes with what without this sheet. So it might be a little convoluted. Keeping up with the conditions can be a pain as someone who tries to memorize rules and tries to make sure I don't have to reference a lot of things. Sometimes it's a pain to keep up with those conditions. A pro, I will say, about the system of Onslaught is the scenario system, the way that they are going about it. We've seen this in the base game, though the base game is very basic, but we saw this a lot more in Frogmire. Basically, their scenarios are deep. They're built for at-home play. They're built to be a 1v1 that goes typically 8 rounds, maybe 10 rounds. And the way that they're going in the direction of these scenarios is great. There's depth to them. It's not just me versus you, and I fight you, and my person hits yours and you hit me. No, it doesn't do that. It's objective based. It has victory points. It has, and some of the victory points may not make sense. You might be thinking, wait, they're driving me to this other goal than what I thought. I want to just smash my opponent's face, but I get no victory points for that. So that has to be secondary. But what I like most is that all the scenarios you see are not tournament scenarios, because I look at it from competitive, right? So the ones you get in Frogmire, you don't have to worry about how does this scenario work in a tournament, because tournament scenarios are different. They might use the same core that you see in Frogmire that you might see in the base game, but they change it slightly, right? They decrease the amount of rounds you get. They may lower the amount of monsters you have there. Maybe they move some of the pieces around. Maybe the chests are a little bit closer to each starting area. Maybe they don't really touch the stats, I don't believe, on monsters, but they probably change their locations. And so that means they don't have to build these scenarios out for each expansion or, like the Benefactor kit. They don't have to build the scenarios out thinking, oh, how will this play in a tournament? No, they just build separate scenarios for tournaments. They use the core and they build it. I love it, because the hardest thing for games at times is to balance between competitive and casual. You want the competitive side to grow, because those are the ones who, hey, what do you know, create a podcast, talk about the game a lot. Those are the ones you want to be out there, as advocates for the game. But the casual players are also the ones buying the game the most, probably, right? So you want a balance between the two, because it's a wide open market for Onslaught. And I think the scenario system lends itself to be very, very good. The downside, this is kind of a con in the scenario system, is, and might be me, but if I'm looking at this from a casual standpoint, and I'm looking at stuff like the Benefactor, or maybe Frogmire is a better example. It's really difficult at this time to do a scenario system that continues from game to game to game, from scenario to scenario to scenario. Because like Frogmire, I believe, had what, like 5 scenarios, and they were all intertwined. So you started with scenario 1, and it grew into 2, 3, 4, and 5. But when you sit down for 1 and then you go to 2, there's not very much that carries over. Your characters all start back over at full health. They're not leveled up. They don't have anything like that. And that's fine, right? Like, because some people might not be playing this. You know, it's not necessarily like Gloomhaven, where the game continues to grow. That's not the intent. But that doesn't mean it couldn't exist. And I think that brings me to... I think one of the fixes that could fix for that is also one of my other pros. So I know I'm kind of going off on the pros con things, but one of the things I like about the game inherently is the level up system and how that works. How you gain XP by hitting, by healing, looting chests, and once you hit that magical number of 5, then you get to choose one of 2 level up cards. Cool. They're not overly powerful. Some are better than others. Some of them could use a little balancing because some are kind of underwhelming, but maybe that'll change with the different scenarios. But I like that, right? Like, how do you introduce leveling up in a game that's built around like one encounter? And so I think they've done a brilliant job of doing that, kind of giving you that level up feel of 5e without having to change stats, radically change your character, add another like subclass, all sorts of stuff. It's just, hey, your character now has this extra ability. A lot of them are one-offs. Some of them are very important. Staghar, for example, gets what's it called, Beast Bond or Bestial Bond or something like that, to where anytime his Wildfire Spirit attacks, he gets to lower a cooldown. One cooldown ability's cooldown by 1. That's huge because both his abilities, I believe, are 5 turn cooldowns. I think the heal might be a 3, but it makes him more powerful. But it's not just an instant, I'm super strong Wildfire Druid, right? So the level up system's great. I think it's a cool way of just adding that extra wrinkle, adding a little bit more customization to the game on a game-to-game basis. But I do think it can be improved upon. And this kind of goes back to the scenario system, the con of scenarios. I would like to see with Onslaught, because the core game itself is good. Like, the mechanics, I feel like, is great. I would like to see more carryover in future scenarios from scenario 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, to where you can watch your characters grow. But the system, unfortunately, on Onslaught isn't built that way, right? And that's fine. But I think there's room to grow with that. And the way they do that, I think, is the level up system. As of now, they only have 2 level up cards per character. I think, and maybe this is tricky balance-wise, I think they can introduce more potential level up cards. And we're not talking a bunch, but a couple per character, so I guess it might be a bunch. But basically, for a campaign, quote-unquote, campaign scenario setting, so if you're playing through Frogmire, let's use Frogmire as an example, and you're going to play through I'm using quotes, you can't see them over audio, but I'm using quotes to say this campaign, it would be nice to see some carryover. So maybe you worked hard on leveling up this character, and so maybe that level up carries over into the next game, the next scenario, and your character starts back over. Same stats. Remember, leveling up doesn't change stats. You might heal from it, but it doesn't change stats. And so going into the second scenario, I start over, I could level up again, and I get an additional level up card. And so those can stack and you would obviously put a cap on it at some point, right? But basically, those level up cards would give you that sense of continuation from the previous scenario. Basically, the thought process behind that is I go through the first scenario and then my characters take a short rest, which is typical for D&D, right? You take a short rest, so that means they heal all the way back up. Maybe most of their abilities go back to 0. Start a new session. So I think that's one thing they could really take away maybe from a future scenario is introducing a, and this is purely for scenario kits, scenario expansions, for tournaments, this won't matter. But for the casual players who may want to treat this as kind of like a potential one-shot, having those level up cards could be great. Having additional ones where it's like, hey, you shuffle the cards, your level up cards, and you have to pick 2 to be your face down cards per game. Because you can only level up once and you'll have an option of 2. You level up, you pick one of them, the other one goes back into your level up deck. Next game, shuffle them, 2 additional cards. And you just keep gaining those level up cards, and it might be minor bumps, very minor things, but it would add that extra wrinkle to the game to allow you to continue scenarios further and further, and to create a miniature campaign to where I am fighting Froghemoth at the end, right? Like, I am fighting him, having gone through these trials and tribulations, to where my Drom has leveled up 4 times. He could still easily be wiped out because he still only has the 10 health. But maybe he's got a little bit more AC. Maybe he's got a little pizzazz now because he's been leveling up, right? And maybe his level up cards, the once per game thing might be permanent for the scenario. So you may, once you use it, that level up card's gone for the rest of the whole scenario kit. But either way, I think that's a way to add another wrinkle to the game to continue on a foundation I think is strong, the level up system, and to allow your characters to evolve from scenario to scenario. And obviously this mechanic doesn't have to, if you're playing one scenario, you'd only get the 2 cards, but going forward you can have in there, if you're continuing this to scenario 2, remember who leveled up, and maybe just like some weapons, right? I believe in Frogmire, you can only, whatever treasure you get, you can only carry over some. Well, then do that with that too. Just say only a couple characters can bring over their level ups. To go back to some of the cons, I think one of the cons of the game system is movement, I guess. I myself, once again, HeroClix player first, but I'm strongly becoming an Onslaught player as well. I'm fine with the orthogonal method of movement where you can only move up, down, left, right. You can't move diagonal. I'm okay with that. You get over it quickly. Problem is with that kind of system, higher movement is stronger. In a lot of these scenarios that you play, having a high movement, like the movement points become a very powerful stat. To the point where, and this might be an inherent problem with the game, it's where I feel like defense feels sometimes not pointless, but like the 3rd tier stat at this point, where I'm looking at what's my attack bonus and what's my movement points. Because if you're rolling 2d20s, right, if your defense is a 14 and they've got a +5, well, they only need a 9 and they have 2d20s to roll, right? They've got a pretty good chance of hitting at a 14. And I think the average, is maybe 16. So that puts armor down low, where it's like, okay, as much as you would like high armor, like a 20, 22, that's still not impossible to hit. But that's where you have a better chance of not being hit. Movement, though, gets you to objectives faster. It gets you to chests faster to loot for treasure. It allows you to attack easier if you have a decent range. It allows you to get in position. It allows you to get out of danger, outpace your opponents. Movement is incredibly strong in this game. So that's kind of, for me, a little bit of a con. Something where I feel like, I hope they're working on kind of balancing that a bit. I don't know exactly how you do that. Frogmire might be a great example because of the introduction of water being, hindering terrain for movement purposes, or that might also exacerbate a problem where it's like, okay, well, slowing people down because of Frogmire just means having that extra movement points is even more important. So not to say that movement in whole is bad. It's just sometimes I feel like there's certain characters that have a 3 movement. I think a couple of the mini arrows do. Some of the beefier, tankier characters, like a 3 movement feels incredibly bad. And it's almost so bad where it's like I don't necessarily want to play that character. Sometimes. Since I did 2 pros in a row, I'll do another con. And this kind of goes hand in hand with talking about movement. The maps themselves of Onslaught, they're beautiful maps. I love the way that the maps are built, where they're not necessarily asymmetrical, but they are reflective. So maybe that is asymmetrical. But they are, equal opportunity for most of the scenarios and most of the sides. But this is me coming once again from HeroClix, where, WizKids has had a problem with those maps as well, right? Being accurate, showing things correctly. It's almost impossible to look at these Onslaught maps, and that includes the Frogmire maps, and identify what is regular terrain, what is water, what is elevation 1, what is elevation 2. You have to have another piece of paper, which is a map reference guide, to show you what each tile is. And I think that takes away a little bit from the game. I understand looking at the maps and seeing the beautiful artwork and watching your characters out there is great. But if I'm having to look at my character's space, trying to plan out their moves, and I can't look at the map they're on, I'm having to also keep going back and forth and referencing this other sheet, it's kind of complicated. Kind of takes away and removes the ambiance that I'm having to kind of pull out a bit and say, okay, well, wait, this ruined temple that I'm at in Frogmire, this little section here is actually elevation 1 and it goes up to elevation 2. You cannot tell that on the map because the artwork doesn't lend itself to that. You can know some of the things you can ascertain, right? Like if there's a little bit of a wall somewhere, you could probably say, okay, that looks like it's probably a wall. And you look it up and, hey, what do you know? Yes, it's impassable terrain, it's a wall. But I think they could do a little bit more to add a little something. They don't have to go as far as HeroClix, which HeroClix has, that little thin surround of the square that shows green is hindering, red is elevation. They don't have to do that. But I feel like they could add a little something to just show, hey, this is a higher elevation. Or this is an elevation 2, this is elevation 1. A little something in there that will help you see it as you're playing. A pro, and I've got one more pro, and I've got one more con. So don't worry, everybody. The pro I've got is the game's balance as a whole. I know I talked about movement being a little bit out of whack. I am specifically talking about the faction balance. Now, I'm sorry, many arrows. The way I view faction balance is kind of not thinking of the many arrows. As bad as that may be. It's kind of, everything feels pretty balanced outside of the many arrows. So you could say that's a con, right? The poor mini arrows are a little bit weaker. But, man, when I'm playing, choosing between the Zentarum, the Harpers, and the Red Wizards, you're gonna probably have a good time with good options with all 3 of those. Zentarum's a little faster, sure. Harpers, I feel like, are a little bit more well-rounded. Red Wizards have, I feel like, a little bit higher damage, but they offset that with being a bit more frail. They're about as mobile as Zentarum, or at least close to it. And then the mini wizards are tankier, but they're slower, and I think that's the reason why there's the trade-off there with the with many arrows, right? Like the many arrows, when I'm looking through all the characters, there may be one character with a movement 5, whereas I know red wizards have 2, maybe 3. Zentarum have that as well. Yeah, like all the many arrows are at 4. I mean, most of them are at 4. And with movement being so important, that missing that one movement is pretty huge. So that's kind of why I'm saying with many arrows. So if we keep many arrows out of it for now, even with the sellswords, I feel like and the sellswords do help. They help many arrows. They help almost every faction. Would love some sellswords. I love the concept of sellswords. I look to add them in almost every game just to have that option. Molly Fairhill, amazing. I know I didn't talk good about her before, but I've used her in a couple games where I got poisoned a bit by an enemy red wizard or something like that. Having condition removal is pretty nice, just saying. But I feel like Harpers and Terran red wizards, you could not tell me playing off one is incredibly better than the other. Now this is, of course, coming across if they fix Chloe, because obviously Chloe with Harper's, with her bard ability, and I think they've said that they're going to look at it. If not, they've already fixed it. I know that's been mentioned on the Discord a few times. So they might have already booted her down a tiny bit. But if not, hopefully they will soon, because it is something that I think needs to happen. But once she's down a bit, like honestly, when I'm picking my team and looking at all 3 factions, even the many arrows, I'm not looking at it thinking, oh, I absolutely don't want, like, I'm just going to lose to Zentarum because I'm playing red wizards, or I'm just going to lose to Harpers because I'm playing Zentarum. It just doesn't happen. The game is relatively balanced, and when you're picking your characters, sometimes you have really difficult decisions, and that's good for the game, right? Like, if I'm playing red wizards, there's no guaranteed I am playing these figures every single time. There is definite times where I'm like, oh, well, I don't want to use Quella this time. Maybe I don't want to build into skeletons. Maybe I don't want to use Staghard because I don't need summons. Maybe I don't want to use Vendra because I'm crazy, because Vendra's awesome. Like, each faction has their couple pieces that you're like, ooh, that's good. Ooh, that's good. But it leads to a lot of team building where I have to sit here and debate, and then you add in the fact that it is sellswords, and it's an even further debate of, well, do I want to swap out one of my good characters for Drom, or for Molly, or for Hengaku? So I think the balance of this game, they've done a really good job of keeping things mostly balanced, and if something gets out of control, like Chloe's getting a little bit out of control, they've been shown to, yeah, let's tone that down a bit. Yeah, let's boost that up a bit. And that's great. That's what a game needs. A game needs to be able to be flexible and to be shown to, yeah, let's fix this. If you want a game to succeed, it has to. The last con that I want to talk about is the cover system. It's very convoluted. The starter rulebook, or the rulebook that we have, does not do a very good job of explaining it, and even I am confused by it a lot of the times. Now, I know, talking to people at Worlds, talking to Alex Davey, he mentioned, yeah, they're looking into it. Maybe they're gonna, maybe they can explain it a little bit better. Because right now, trying to teach this game to a new person and explain, oh, do they have cover? Do they not have cover? Is a little difficult, especially, once again, me coming from HeroClix, being based off of where you base it off the center of the square, not the corners. It's hard for me to wrap my head around of, oh yeah, you have line of sight as long as 3 of your corners can go towards one of their corners without going through, like, blocking or an opposing character. And then you get cover if, like, at least one corner... I may be saying this wrong. Sorry. Once again, it's really hard for me to explain. Let me just read it. That's easier. After declaring the target of an attack, this is what the rulebook says. Check to see if hindering terrain lies between the character and the space. If an uninterrupted line cannot be drawn from at least one corner of the attacker's space to at least all three corners of the target space without passing through hindering terrain, the target has cover from the attack. So you might think, well, that's easy. But it's not necessarily easy. Drawing lines is difficult. When you have to draw lines to three corners, and usually it's very bunched up. There's a lot of characters around. And adding in what I mentioned before with a map that doesn't necessarily have the best, like, here's the elevation 1 and 2, so you're having to kind of go between the two squares and look at the reference. It could be a bit of a hassle, especially for new players trying to figure all of that out. How do I know if I have cover or not? Because there's a lot of characters' abilities that are based off of cover. So it could be a hassle to keep up with that. Trying to figure out exactly what is cover, what is not cover, whether you have line of sight, whether you don't have line of sight. It could be a pain at times. Now I'm hoping from what they've said at Worlds, it's true that they come out with like a better explanation, like a better way of saying, here's how it is. You just draw from one of your corners. Can it go to these other three? Here's what is considered hindering. Because I haven't even mentioned like the elevation aspect of it, where it's like, okay, if there's an elevation in between that's higher, well, yeah, you have cover from it. But if I'm shooting down from above, do I have cover? Do I not? Like, it's difficult, and it's really difficult for me personally because I come from the HeroClix standpoint, right? Where it's like, can they see through elevation? If not, you can only attack someone that's on the rim. But that's not the case in D&D Onslaught. D&D Onslaught, you could be in the middle of, a couple spaces back from the rim of elevation. You could still shoot. They just have cover. So there's penalties. But all that to say is, like, my cons are, most of them are probably me personally. Sometimes I struggle with understanding certain things. But also I think if I struggle with them and being a rather educated game player, playing a lot of games, I assume a lot of other people also struggle with it. And I apologize for being nitpicky about the game. I love Onslaught. I think it's a great game. I think it's best that we look at the game itself while it's growing, while we're getting new releases, and say, hey, is there any way to make it better? What are the bad things about it currently? Or not bad, like negative things about it. And how can we fix that? How can we make maps maybe look better to like cover the different terrain types? How can we explain the cover system a little bit better? What about conditions? Is there any way to slim any of that down? Or is there a better reference card or what with it? And some of these cons don't have solutions, and that's perfectly fine. I do think the pros outweigh the cons. Because I do think the initiative system, the way that scenarios work, the factions, the characters themselves, how you level up, how you go about and, play the game with 5e style rules, but still have a little bit of flavor of, Onslaught is great. So that's going to do for this episode. I know this is releasing later in the day. It's been a wild November 1st for me. But I hope you enjoy it. I hope you get out there and play Onslaught. Hit up your store once again to see if any of the storyline OP kits have come in, or order them yourselves from, order them through your store. Because I think the game is pretty fantastic. Friday, HeroClix Friday, don't forget, I believe we finished through the rares? Yeah, we did. I think we went through all of the rares of the Wheels of Vengeance set. So we've got the rest of the set to go through. A lot to talk about there. there's a lot with that set that I'm excited to talk about. So I will see all of you on Friday. I hope you have a fantastic rest of the day today. Fantastic Thursday, and I will talk to you guys on Friday. See ya.